Okay, next question. Has the Bible been altered? The Bible is not a translation of translations. It was written in Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew, which people still speak today.
Yes, but I want to emphasize this. Unless you speak Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew, you're reading a translation. It is a translation of translations because it gets translated from one language to another. If you read it in English, you're reading a translation.
No one questions whether we have the original words of Plato, but there are only 7 ancient copies, and the oldest are separated from the original by 1,200 years.
To put this in perspective here, Plato is much, much, much older than the Bible. Plato's writings were not regarded as divine word as was what was written in the Bible. It makes sense that his works would only be scantily preserved. Now, she did word it very specifically because she said ancient works. So we have 7 ancient works. I think she's talking about 7 ancient original as can be, copies of Plato's works. And that's probably true, but we have 250 actual copies of his work that are not like modern copies. They're older copies. To compare Plato to the Bible, it's just a bad analogy. Like you're comparing 2 different things here.
Socrates has no surviving manuscripts, and the closest book printed ancient copies of the Bible is Homer's Iliad, with 643 copies within 500 years of the original.
It really doesn't matter how many copies there are of like Socrates or Aristotle, Homer, Plato. Like it doesn't really matter about all those things because just because the Bible was copied more, because it's still a very central thing in our society, that does not mean anything about whether or not it's true. Harry Potter could be copied for hundreds of years, thousands of years even, and that still wouldn't make it true. It could have billions upon billions of copies of it. It is still not reality. It is still fantasy.
By enormous contrast, there are more than 5,600 copies of the New Testament within 100 years of the original.
I don't see how she can know that. I don't know what they're counting as copies, because the way that she's saying it is like we have all of these things from the original. We don't have the original. We have fragments of early copies. We don't have the original. So there's no way that we could have 560 copies of the original because we don't know what the original was in order to compare them to the copies that we do have. Now, we probably do have 560 copies from about 300 AD onward, but that's not 100 years after the originals were written. Paul was writing in the 50s, so 100 years after that would have been 150. That's the middle of the 2nd century. That is actually when the separate parts of the Bible were compiled together into what we would know as the modern Bible.
Let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the 1940s, a shepherd boy found what are now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran caves in Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain the oldest copies of scripture ever found, even as early as 4th century BC. Secular archaeologists also confirmed their validity. Fragments of the book of Isaiah were recovered, which was written hundreds of years before Christ, and not a word had been altered. It is safe to say that the Bible has the same words today that it's had throughout the centuries.
Just because a book is copied accurately, regardless of whether it was a human copying it or a machine producing copies of it, that says nothing about whether or not what's printed or copied is accurate and really happened in history. That has literally nothing to do with accuracy of the Bible. It has something to do with the accuracy of copying the Bible in the Jewish culture and in the Christian culture, but it has nothing to do with whether or not the Bible is accurate and correct in history.